So we're going to start talking about classification. We've learned a lot in this unit so far. We've been learning about origins of the universe, origins of the Earth, how life began on this planet, how life has evolved on this planet. And life has indeed evolved on this planet, evolved quite a bit. We have a very rich, abundant diversity of life on this planet. With so much life, how do we go about naming it? How do we go about understanding the evolutionary relationships between different organisms? Well, one method of doing this is classification, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So what you're seeing here are two different methods of classification, Linnaean method and cladistics, and we're going to talk about both of those. This image here is actually looking at the three domains of life: bacteria, Archaebacteria, and then Eukaryota, and we're going to talk about those, and these images are giving you different examples of those three domains. So let's get started. So classifying organisms. Classification is grouping organisms in a systemized method. Classification is known as taxonomy. Taxonomy is essentially classification. So the definition of taxonomy is the science of naming and grouping biological organisms on the basis of shared characteristics. So why do we classify? What is the need for classification within the scientific community? It provides a universal language so scientists can communicate globally. It groups organisms to show evolutionary relationships. So how do we know what common ancestors modern humans share with other primates? Well, we can look at different characteristics, both physical and also molecular, specifically DNA. So these systems have changed over time. And we're going to talk about that change. So how do we know how related we are to this pig, for example? Well, classification can help us to answer that question. So let's talk about taxonomy. How do we classify? Well, what taxonomists look for are similarities in physical features called homologous structures in order to show relatedness. Now, we've talked about homologous structures before. We've talked about the bones that are found in the arm of a human, the leg of a cat or a dog, the flipper of a whale, and the wing of a bat. Additionally, taxonomists are also considering evolution and genetics by examining similarities in biomolecules such as DNA and RNA. So how similar are our genes to the genes of a mouse or the genes of a starfish? So what biologists or taxonomists are wanting to know is, are we more related to a mouse or to a starfish? And we can look at physical features such as homologous structures, but we can also look at biomolecules such as DNA, RNA, and also amino acid sequences. So remember, amino acids are what build proteins. One type of classification system is called the Linnaean classification system. It is named after Carl Linnaeus. Linnaean classification uses the following groups: kingdoms, which are divided into classes, which are divided into orders, which are divided into families, which is divided into genus, which is divided into species. This is a rank-based system, meaning that it starts very small and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It takes into account only structural differences, so it takes into account only physical differences and not DNA differences. This is a quick breakdown of how the Linnaean system works. We have a common ancestor. That common ancestor is placed into one of the three domains, either bacteria, archaebacteria, or eukaryotes. It's then placed into one of the six kingdoms. It would then be placed into an order, and then a family, and then a genus, and then a species, etc. All right. Biological classification. So some examples of how this works. So remember the classification system, it starts very broad and it becomes more and more narrow. So for instance, we all live on planet Earth. We all live on the North American continent. We all live in the United States. We all live in California. Most of us probably live in Marin County, and then your city, your street, and finally your house number. So starting very broad and becoming more and more specific. Those are the different levels of classification: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. One way to remember this: disengaged kids playing chase on freeways get squashed. So pay attention, don't get squashed. This would be a scientific example. The domain is eukarya, meaning that the organism is made out of eukaryote cells, cells that have nucleus. It's in the animal kingdom. It's a chordata. It's a mammal. It's a primate. It's a hominid. It's a Homo sapien, or it's a modern human. So you belong in the eukaryote domain, in the Animalia kingdom, in the Chordata phylum, and the Mammalia class, in the order of primates, in the family of hominids, in the genus Homo, and in the species of sapiens. So this illustration shows the Linnaean classification of a grizzly bear from kingdom to species. And what you can see from this image is it starts very broad, and when it's broad, it includes a lot of different organisms. But as we move through the classification system, it becomes more and more specific, and there are fewer and fewer organisms that the grizzly bear is related to. All right, so let's talk about the three domains: bacteria, archaebacteria, and eukaryota. So archaea, they are single-celled microorganisms. They have no nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. This means they are prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are single-celled organisms that have no nucleus. They adapt quickly to extreme environments, so they can live deep at the bottom of the ocean on these hot vents that are spewing out chemicals that would be very toxic to humans. They live in anaerobic environments, meaning they can live without oxygen. Anaerobic means no oxygen, so they're found in anaerobic mud. They're also found in the digestive tracts of animals. And they can live in extremely hot or salty water, so they can live in very extreme environments. They are prokaryotes that can live in very extreme environments. The domain bacteria. Again, single-celled microorganisms. Because they're single-celled, they're prokaryotes, and they have no nucleus. They were the first forms of life to appear on Earth. So cyanobacteria are in the domain bacteria. And they reproduce very quickly. Bacteria, on average, reproduce every 20 minutes. They come in three different shapes: Spirea, Bacilla, and Cauci. And the different shape actually determines the different type of disease that can be caused by the bacteria. Not all bacteria cause disease, but some do. So why do we put archaebacteria and bacteria into separate domains if they have so many similarities? They're both prokaryotes. So why are they in different domains? Well, they have different ribosomes. Ribosomes are what make proteins. The ribosomes are what bring amino acids together to make proteins. Archaea and bacteria have different ribosomes. Their cell walls have a different structure, and the archaea can survive in a more extreme environment than bacteria can. Also, all known human diseases caused by bacteria are caused by eubacteria. So it's put into a different domain. This is why we put archaea and bacteria into different domains. And then finally, the domain to which humans belong, eukarya. These are organisms that contain a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. They can be unicellular or multicellular. So there are some single-celled organisms that have a nucleus and therefore are not bacteria or archaebacteria. They are eukaryotes. They are the most flexible and forming cooperative colonies, meaning that they're able to live together in a social setting. Kind of strange to think of organisms other than humans living in a social setting, but it does happen. So these are plants living in a social setting. Fish, as we know, live in social settings. And definitely primates. All right, the Linnaean classification system, it's no longer used. Scientists no longer use it because it doesn't take into account evolution. So why do we still learn the system? Well, the Linnaean classification system is no longer used to classify organisms in order to better understand evolutionary relationships between those organisms. However, it is still used to name organisms. And this naming process is what we know as binomial nomenclature. These are the rules for naming an organism. It has to have two parts, a genus and a species. For instance, Homo sapien. Homo is the genus, sapien is the species. Felis domesticus is cat. Felis is the genus, domesticus is the species. You always capitalize genus, but you never capitalize species. And you either underline the name or use it in italics. This is why you see Homo sapien and Felis domesticus in italics. So Linnaean system is no longer used in order to classify organisms, but it is still used to name organisms. All right, the current classification system that we use is known as cladistics. We use this system in science because this classification system takes into account evolution. Scientists group organisms based on shared evolutionary history. How cladistics work. Organisms are grouped together based on shared unique characteristics from the group's distinct common ancestors. Scientists, taxonomists are using fossils, they're using living specimens, and they're also using molecular sequencing of DNA to hypothesize evolutionary relationships. We call this phylogeny. Hypothesized evolutionary relationships are known as phylogeny. We represent these relationships on a family tree that's called a cladogram, and it looks something like this. So we're looking at all of these organisms and how they are evolutionarily related to each other by looking at a cladogram. And this cladogram is representing a hypothesized evolutionary relationship amongst these organisms. That hypothesized evolutionary relationship is known as a phylogeny. You will learn how to create phylogenies and cladograms in Integrated 3-4. This is the classification system. Basically, the Linnaean classification system is an outdated classification system because it doesn't take into account evolutionary relationships. However, it is still used to name organisms. The modern system for classifying different organisms is known as cladistics. And cladistics is looking at evolutionary relationships. It is proposing a phylogeny, a hypothesized evolutionary relationship, and then presenting that phylogeny on a cladogram. And this is classification.